Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well, and very welcome to our meetup number, is it 7? Number 8, okay. There's been so many that it's kind of hard to track them any more. So very welcome. Probably some of you have already been in HubSpot on the previous meetups. Maybe some of you have been to the very last one in Facebook. So today we're gonna have very nice 2 talks, but before that, so I just want to say thanks to HubSpot for sponsoring everything from food to the venue, swag, which is really nice this time, stickers and so on. Also, of course, we use ReactJS on our entire front-end piece of product. So if any one of you is interested in interviewing, just talk to any of us. We are always hiring. Also, so in the last few weeks, we introduced on our meetup page a code of conduct. So probably most of you have seen them. Just kind of have a glance on it and see what's in there. So we just want you all to feel very welcome. And if you have a feeling ever that anyone is not behaving like they should by the code of conduct, just talk to any of us in HubSpot. So there is plenty of our volunteers in our t-shirts, and you can all recognize them. And the very last thing, so we are always looking for more speakers. And if you have a good idea about what to speak, or you just experimented with some other new cool part related to React, also send us an email, come talk to us. We would love to hear from you. So our 2 speakers for today are Elizabeth and Lamberto. Lamberto is going to go first, and he's going to give us a talk about testing in React.js. After that, we have Elizabeth talking about how to do SVG in React components. So welcome, Lamberto.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Lamberto, and today I'm going to talk about testing, one of our more appreciated activities in the front-end world. So a little bit about me. I joined HubSpot about roughly 6 months ago, a little less, and I come from Italy. I've been living in Dublin for about 3 years, almost 3 years now, and I've been loving it. So I'm also passionate about front-end, and I've worked in Ryanair and AWS before joining HubSpot. So as I said, today we are going to focus on testing. So what to test, why we need testing, different types of tests, and then we're gonna go a bit more we're gonna focus more on the unit testing side of things, especially with React. So I'm gonna show you what we use to test React components. We use this framework called Endtoend. Many of you might have heard of it. And then we're gonna also cover a bit of the other side of testing. So the automation side of testing, which is the acceptance tests or end-to-end tests. And in particular, we're gonna see something. We're gonna see how we do that with Selenium.js and browser step. But first of all, how many of you, raise your hands, how many of you have never written a test before, a unit test before? That's great. That's perfect. How many of you have never written an automation test before? It's even better. Great. So we're going to focus on those things now. So first and foremost, why and what to test. Essentially, testing should be one of those parts of the development process that makes you confident that shipping new stuff, delivering new features, fixing bugs actually doesn't break the app in other parts. And this historically has never been a real pleasure. Let's say sometimes we just don't really enjoy the activity of doing tests, of writing tests. Sometimes it's just challenging. Sometimes it's just time consuming. So we can't afford to do it. And in all those situations, typically having the right tools and just trying a little bit more usually helps and fixes all the issues. And if that's the case, testing can also be even a fun activity at some point. So first of all, today, as I said, we're going to focus on unit testing and end-to-end testing. There are so many other ways to differentiate about testing. So integration tests, acceptance tests, they all have different definitions. So today I'm going to skip that part. I'm just going to focus on the technicalities of them. So in particular, we consider unit tests when we are testing the single units of our app. So the components, the React components, but also whatever utility method we're using, selectors if you're using that, also Redux reducers if you're using Redux, action creators, and all that kind of stuff. So as opposed to end-to-end testing, where you do want to test your app as a whole. So you want to test how those components behave together. You want to test sections of your app. And you don't care about the framework behind that. It can be Angular, it can be React, it doesn't matter. And unit testing usually is way faster to write, faster to execute, and typically you bind that to your build. So if the testing fails, your build should fail, and you don't progress with that. Whether with the end-to-end tests, you typically you want to have your code already somewhere, say a testing environment, and you want to run your tests on your test environment. So it doesn't break the builds, it does break the next deployment. So for example, if you have multiple stages, it prevents you to pushing your code into the next stage. And also one key difference is that unit testing usually gives you an idea of what's wrong. Since it's very focused on one single component, single unit, it really tells you, oh, this thing is wrong, don't do it. Whether acceptance test just tells you something wrong in this page or in this whole workflow, and you have to figure out yourself. So it's very important when you're doing that you know what to use and you can leverage on tools that makes this task a bit easier. So first of all, one thing that many people think is, do we need to do both things? Do we need to do unit testing and end-to-end testing? I mean, obviously, yes, you do. So if you were wondering, you can have 100% testing on all the components of your app, but still that doesn't mean that the whole app is going to work properly. So when you put them together, something like this can happen, which is not nice, obviously, or something like this can happen, which is even worse, probably. So you don't want that. But since we're here to talk about software, just to give you a real life example, this is something happened to my team a while back, a few months back. So essentially, I work in the HubSpot Academy team. We deal with certifications, videos, teaching people how to use our product. And as part of our app, we have quizzes to test what people understood about HubSpot. And obviously, we have automation tests in place. So one test was actually testing that the user could take a quiz, and they could refresh the page and retake the quiz. So the whole idea was, do the quiz, refresh the page. You're supposed to see a screen like this one, and click retake the quiz and test it again. And well, there's a story behind that. We had a bug about that, but then we fixed it, so we created the test. That's usually part of your workflow. So what happened was that sometimes in our most loved browser, Internet Explorer, that didn't work. So what was going on is that the test was doing the quiz, was taking the quiz, refreshing the page, and the screen was not happening. The completion screen was not showing up. Instead, it was showing again, like here in this moment, it was showing again the normal first question of the quiz. So we spent a good afternoon trying to figure out what was going on. And after a whole bunch of madness, which no, you're not supposed to read it, it's basically just we trying to figure out what was going on. We figured that Internet Explorer has this habit of caching AJAX requests sometime, same way as it does with assets, static assets. So this obviously was only going on with the Internet Explorer. It wasn't always happening. So like trying to manually reproduce the test, the error didn't work. So we were really trying to, I mean, in this case, the test was really giving us a really good indication that something was wrong without really telling us what. But still, it's really valuable because we couldn't have spotted the issue because it wasn't obviously easy to reproduce manually. So this is another example of why you do need automation tests. So just so you know, the issue was obviously that the progress of the user wasn't really returned on the second call. So we were just showing the same result as before. So yes, so why testing? It improves code quality, which means it improves the development process. And obviously it's faster, more frequent. It can be done more frequently and more consistently than any other type of manual testing. And that applies to both unit and automation tests. And it also works as a documentation for your code. So nowadays it's really difficult to keep up with all the changes that we do to our code base, right? So we don't really write documentation, but the test can act as a documentation to your code because you are forced to keep it up to date. Otherwise it will break. And it also prevents regression bugs. So if you have a set of manual steps that you're always doing in order to check that everything is still good, like a smoke test, you can automate. That's the perfect scenario to automate, and that's what tests are for. And finally, yes, it's hard. It's difficult to set up the whole thing at the beginning, but then it quickly pays off. It becomes your best tool to prevent bugs and to prevent that the new and to make sure that the new features are exactly as designed. So why and what to automate is also important. Not everything needs to be automated. So when this is especially true when we are talking about end-to-end tests, because one of the key differences is that they are slower. They are way slower than unit tests. So you don't really want to test really every single aspect. You should be focusing on those things that you typically do as part of your smoke testing when you're pushing your stuff. So obviously there are different opinions about the percentage. You should be doing 70% and 30%, 70 unit and 30%. But in this case, it's really up to what parts of your app you consider key features of your application. Definitely test whenever there is some complex logic involved or calculations. That's obviously most of the time is covered in a unit test as well, but still doesn't prevent you to create an automation test to cover it up. And definitely, and this is more on the acceptance test side, whenever you have to test multiple platforms or multiple browsers, you do need that test in place. You don't want to do the same actions all over again on different browsers. And of course, when the manual execution would take a lot of time, or it would be complicated to achieve, or you need to set up a lot of data before, that's definitely one of the cases where you want to automate. Now, down to the more technical parts. React, how do we test? How do we unit test React? There are different ways to do it. One way that we adopted here in AppSwap is using this framework, Enzyme, which is developed by Airbnb. And Enzyme essentially allows you to traverse and test React components and to render them without the need of a real document behind. I'm gonna talk a bit more about that in a second. We also use Jasmine just to run our tests, which gives us the assertions, matchers, spies, all that kind of stuff is out of the box. And it also supports asynchronous testing, which it's obviously something we want with the Redux actions, and we use Redux as well. And it's framework independent. So down to Enzyme, it basically wraps different other tools you might have used. Actually, how many of you have used Enzyme before? That's great. That's a great number. So yeah, you know that there are two different, actually there are three, but the third one is not really very used. Anyway, there are the two main modes to render your components are shallow and mount. So shallow is basically, as the name suggests, it only render the component that you're testing, doesn't go deep into the children. So if you have a component with a bunch of other React component nested, those won't be rendered. You can still check, you can still assert, for example, that those components are rendered. And that's typically what we do. We try to avoid going the mount way unless we absolutely have to. And shallow, the benefit of using shallow is that you really have a real unit testing that it's only that particular component that you're testing. And it's mocking basically everything out. And the other side of the medal, though, is that if you want to test the component did mount or the component did update, those two methods, they're not hit by the shallow mode. In that case, you do have to go the mount way. Or if you really want to go, if you want to do something that might be called more an integration test, not in the classical end-to-end test, but it's a little bit more than a component and a little bit less than just testing the whole section. So what we typically do is we divide testing a React component in two parts. So we definitely want to test the output. We want to test conditional output, so make sure that all the different scenarios or all the different paths are hit by the test. And in this case, well, you can see that in this example, we're testing a card, and we're testing that that it's using one component inside. We're testing that we are showing some categories, and we're testing that the correct links are provided. And then the other side is the behavior of your component. So you want to simulate clicks, you want to simulate whatever action your component is handling, and you typically do that by using the spice, and you pass the spice to your component. So one nice thing about Enzyme is that it gives you this nice set props, so you don't have to re-instantiate the component. You can just update those props and expect that the on-click handler, in this case, is called. And that's for testing a component. Well, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but this is, in bare bones, this is how you could divide your test. Then, obviously, there's the easier part, I guess. So testing a reducer, that's essentially, well, this is obviously if you're using Redux, but it's essentially the easiest part because it's just a function. It's a plain JavaScript function, so you just provide an initial state and the action you want to test, and you just expect that the result is as you expect. It can be just long, but it's usually the easier part of testing. And then there is the action dispatcher part. In this case, there are several ways to do that. One of them is using the Redux mock store library. For whoever of you who hasn't used this, it's basically a mock store. It basically gives you a store which is more lightweight compared to the normal Redux store and doesn't really affect any reducer at all. It's really just takes care of, basically counts all the action that gets dispatched so that you can then assert that they are as you expect. For example, in this case, we're dispatching an action called clear lesson down there, and we just expect that all the actions dispatched are basically that one. So this is an easy case. This is a synchronous action, nothing fancy. You can do that without any Redux mock store library. Probably it will be the same. When it gets more complicated is when you have asynchronous actions, like in this case, we're dispatching a fetching request. So this is just basically to allow a loader to appear, and then we're doing the fetch, and then obviously we dispatch a success or an error request. So in this case, you can still do without a library behind you, but with Redux mock store, it's really easy to just dispatch that action and expect everything to be. I mean, you can chain the actual call, and then at the end of it, you can just check all the actions that you dispatched. So that's a really nice way. And then there are some opinions on this as well. So should you test a Redux container? Should you not? it really depends on the container. I mean, some of us are using selectors, so that abstracts away the logic from the map state to props to your selector, and then you're testing the selector. So it really depends if you're doing that or not. But in cases where you do have some logic in your Redux containers, then you might be interested in testing them. So if you ever tried that with Enzyme, you might have seen these could not find store in either the context or props and blah, blah, blah. So essentially it's missing something when you're trying to render that in this mock environment. So you can work around that by using the component.wrapped components, and that gives you the original component behind the Redux Connect call. But that doesn't mean, I mean, that way you're not really testing the map state to props, which could be one of your purposes. So one way to work around this other thing is to reuse Redux mock store in a different way. So in this case, we're essentially creating a mock store, which is more likely than the normal store, just dispatching a dummy action at the beginning and running all the reducers just at the beginning, and then using shallow or mount, whatever you want to use. In that case, it wouldn't make a difference, and passing that new store, creating as a context to the component. That's the second parameter that shallow accepts. So this way you can then just test the component whatever way you were planning to as a normal component. Now the other side, end-to-end testing. So there are different tools that allow you to test your application as a whole. In this case, we're using Selenium, which is, it's basically, we're using Selenium WebDriver in particular, which is a library that gives you a whole set of selectors to go through your web page. It's essentially hitting your web page like in a controlled browser. And you can program Selenium tests in many different languages. We chose JavaScript, of course. And the beauty of it is that it has a really nice API, and it's really used. It has a really big community, so it's really well supported. And it has support for. I mean, it can be used also on many browsers. There are drivers that you need to specify in order to use it. So for example, I'm using Firefox, I need to install Jekyll driver. I want to test Google Chrome, then I need to install Chrome driver in my own machine and then launch the test. So in this case, we're using Mocha as test driver, as test runner. We could have been used Jasmine as well. Not real differences in that. And one nice thing that we are doing in this case is using the new async await paradigm, because the beauty of it is that it makes the test look like it's synchronous when it's not. So if you have, in this case, we can just read it in a more in an easier way, especially for an acceptance test. So we can just we are getting an element, then we're getting the attribute of an element, clicking the element, and expecting this the browser to be redirected in a specific place. This is a typical acceptance test. So that's the beauty of async await. Now, how do we test all these things in multiple browsers? And most of all, how do we test it automatically whenever we deploy? So in this case, there are several alternatives. One of them is Browser Stack. Others are Sauce Labs, Ghost Lab, cross-browser testing. So all those are doing exactly the same thing, just in a slightly different way. We chose Browser Stack in this case because it gives us basically support for Selenium tests, and we can also test locally, which is pretty nice. So you can essentially launch your tests from your computer against your computer as well. And that's pretty nice. That's bypassing any possible proxy or firewall. More on that in a second. And for essentially how it works is that for each browser that you want to test, you can specify the version, the operating system, and you can specify a set of capabilities from Browser Stack that I'm gonna show you in a moment. And How many of you have used Browser Stack before? Cool. So this is how it looks like, right? If you notice from the slide before, this is how we instantiate Selenium WebDriver. We create the builder with capabilities, and then we build. The only difference is that we're using a different server here, and then we're passing some specific Browser Stack keys and username, along with other configurations like the browser name and that. So Browser Stack capabilities, what are those? How are they useful for our testing environment? So the first one is the video. It gives us a recording of the whole execution of the test, which is pretty handy because you can see at any moment what was going on, and you have an idea of how good or bad your application is performing in that browser. Another thing is visual logs. This is similar to having the video, but it's associated to what the test was doing in that specific moment, like opening the URL or waiting for a selector. Most of the times, the problem with the acceptance tests are that you end up waiting something for too long because that something is not on the page because there was an error or because your test is out of date. So this is really cool because you'll see you were waiting for this selector, but this selector never showed up. So you will see exactly which part of the app. And it's nice because sometimes you have the same selectors everywhere. So this gives you just the combination of the two things along with the timestamp. Another one which was introduced only last July, I think. Anyway, it was introduced recently. It's the network logs. So this gives you basically a dump of all the network requests made by the browser during the execution. And actually, this would have been really nice for us with the original bug that I showed you at the beginning, because in that case, we would have seen the 3 or 4 requests from the browser for the cached request. One thing about the network logs is that it doesn't give you the payload, doesn't give you the response. It just gives you the headers and the payload that you were passing to the request. So it's not ideal. And the other thing is that it can slow down the execution, although that really depends on your app. In my case, if the app is obviously network intensive, then you might want to try it out and see if that works and enable or disable it. But in my specific case, it didn't prove to be really that intensive in terms of slowing down the execution. So it was a nice addition. The other one is the console logs. So, sorry, just one thing about this is that it gives you the log as a HAR file. So you can just visualize that with whatever you want. The other thing is the console logs. So many times, some broken tests also is related to some JavaScript error you have. So having the console logs is really helpful. And unfortunately, it's only for Chrome at the moment, but it's still a nice addition. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because sometimes a test is failing and you really don't know why, even if you watched the video, even if you looked at the console logs, if you looked at the network requests. In this case, you can just debug your test. You can see what's going on by running your debugger locally. And the good thing about this is that it basically works with any browser. So you can, for example, you can attach your debugger to the Chrome instance that's running your test, and then launch the test on Browser Stack in, say, Internet Explorer. And then you can still debug through the Chrome debugger, which is definitely nicer than the Internet Explorer one, if you ever tried that. That's really powerful. That sometimes can save your life, or anyway, at least can fix the test. So this is one cool thing. And there are many other problems, obviously, around acceptance tests, and many of them are fixed just by experience. So you get the problem, you get to know how to fix it, you get to share the knowledge on how to fix that particular issue, and most of them can be like summarized together. I mean, some of them, not most of them, can be summarized as the ones I'm going to show you now. So first, this is pretty obvious, right? if you're running tests, especially acceptance tests, can really run for a long time. So if one of them is failing, you just want to fail the whole execution. So in this case, use the --bail parameter just to stop the whole thing and save yourself a good bunch of minutes to just retry or see what's going on. Also, this is very important, especially if you're using third-party libraries and you're structuring your test in a way that you are targeting some selectors along the page, in the page. And say, for example, those selectors belong to a component that's from a third-party library. It might have some classes in it already, but those classes can change in the future. And then you would end up with a broken test for something that you didn't change. So it's usually always safer to just create your own class, give your own classes to those components, or use some data attributes and try to work out that way. And the reason why we typically prefer the data attributes is that they're not really bound to any particular styling. So you can just drag and drop them to whatever new version of your page you're developing. It's more of a conceptual idea, so it's unlikely that you're gonna bind any styling to your data attribute. And this is probably the karma of acceptance tests, which is avoid sleeping. It's really easy sometimes to just, for example, you're testing a drop down here and there's an animation in between, and you say, okay, I'm just gonna sleep half a second to wait for the animation to complete. And then I'm good to just select whatever item in the drop down. That's usually not a good idea for many reasons. So one of them is that the animation duration can change. Say you don't own entirely the component and someone changes the animation, again, broken test, and there we go. Or even worse, sometimes you do it with something that's bound to an AJAX request, which is, in this case, it's not non-deterministic, so you don't really know how long you're gonna wait. So you just base on pure heuristic. And you should avoid all of that. You should really just use the driver.wait and the until Selenium selector that's provided. So this way, you really just wait for something to show up in your page, not for a certain amount of time to be gone. Also, even if you get the waiting time right, it makes your test really slower, much slower than it needs to be. Say you're waiting, I don't know, just to be safe, I'm gonna wait 1 second here, 1 second there, 1 second there, and then your test suddenly just lasts 5 minutes to test one page. So this is the main thing about the acceptance test. The other thing is sometimes you want to run the same test, you want to run the acceptance test even when the backend is deployed. So say the backend deployed and you change, and that change broke your app. Obviously, you want to capture that as well. So it's important to run the same suite of tests. Now, the problem is sometimes your tests are making assumptions, or they're not really designed to be run in parallel. So for example, they're using some credentials and some data bound to their credentials. So running them in parallel can really affect each other. So it's typically a good practice, no matter what's your deployment process. It's really typically a good practice to just have them bound to different set of data. In our case, we're using different credentials, and that pulls different data out of it. And well, this is obviously something that's typically we do all the time. So cleanup. We want to clean up whatever temporary data that we're writing, because that again could affect the next execution of your test. For example, one way we do that is that we just batch together all of the cleanup actions that we need to execute instead of running them in that specific moment, and we run them at the very last after all the tests have run. And the good thing about that is that it also works when your test fails. So the method is hit even when the tests are failing. So you're always 100% sure that they are going to be hit. They're going to be run. Finally, you want to, as you go, you typically end up just writing the same thing many times. For example, you're waiting for a drop down, you're trying to open a drop down and select something in there, and you're doing that in another place, and then you're doing that in another place. So, and this works with waiting and selecting elements, with opening drop downs, with checking if an element exists, with many other things. And so you should really build your own library around it, and that makes the test even easier to use. Even easier to read, because you can just read the sequence of actions that are really semantically clear to read. So wrapping up, testing should be fun and not scary, and we have the tools to make that happen. We just have to make good use of them and just realize that it's really an important part of the development process. It's not an optional part. Both unit and end-to-end tests are available, as we saw before, and essentially just try to build up your own testing library so that you can make the most of it in a really fast and nice way. So yeah, that's all I have for tonight. So if you have any questions, sure.
So you mentioned
just one moment. We want everyone to hear the question.
Okay. So you mentioned the async function, and that you're using this basically in every test step. Is that correct? Or something? Are you familiar with the queue library where you resolve the promise?
Done.
Yeah. So is that like a remedy for not using queue or something like that?
So in that case, because we're having a similar problem, basically you're closing the promise in that case, so you can't really then anymore. So that's the issue, right? That's what you're referring to.
So I'm asking if, like, in this step, there is like it async or something. You did have, yeah. So it's like, is the promise resolved, and before it goes to the next step, is the async function like working like queue.all or something like that?
In here, you mean?
No, not exactly here, but yeah, I saw some different steps. But
so essentially, what's going on here is that this is returning a promise, which in your test here, you are also you're chaining a then to the same promise, and this then is being chained after that one. So it's gonna be it's gonna be run after these two actions are, well, this action in this case is run. So you don't, in this case, you only have one action dispatched, so there's no other waiting that you need to do.
Okay. Right.
The thing that I noticed with queue, if you've used queue, is that sometimes, for example, we use it with an additional .done. We use the done at the end for other reasons, and in that case, that's basically breaking the promise. So say you're not returning a promise from this action, then how do you test it from here? That's a challenge usually, because you don't have anything to wait. One workaround that is not really clean that I experienced is that you can basically just put a set timeout without any waiting time in that, just to queue your action at the end of it. And since you're mocking all your requests here, basically that's gonna be safe to run your expectations. And actually that's how we do it in our case, because we're using queue.done at the end of the promises. But it was a really particular scenario, so
one more question. We're gonna come later to you.
Hey, so question is about unit testing, and it's mainly like I've seen a lot of tests, especially for Redux, let's say stores and everything. What's your opinion on snapshot testing? Because from my point of view, like it will actually simplify, especially like trivial tests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know there is. It's really growing as a thing. Especially the Jest. For example, Jest snapshots. It's something that we are trying to explore separately. I haven't played around that myself. I think it makes sense. Definitely. For example, we've been having discussions about running them upon API deployments instead of doing the whole suite. It might make sense in that case. But I haven't played with it enough to have a strong opinion on it. But it's something interesting. We're definitely looking at it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We had one person just over there.
Okay, so I have two questions. One is in regards to the end-to-end tests. So when you're running those tests, do you create an embedded database and you mock the APIs, and like you use something like warmock to mock all the calls, or do you actually spin up like use a real database and you hit the real APIs? The other question is, I actually just wanted you to comment on the data test ID attributes that you're using on the elements. Most people would argue that adding code just to make the test work is not advisable, and especially shipping that code to production as well. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, good questions. So on the first one, so essentially we're not spinning up dedicated API services. We're really just relying on what we have there. What we typically do is we run a set of pre-requirement calls just to prepare the environment with the data that we want. And that's in combination with the cleaning your new data that you're creating at the end. That usually makes it for us. So we do want to test whatever data we have in QA, because we're basically either creating that data in that moment, just before the test starts, or it's in a pristine situation where we know we can work it out. But yeah, ideally you could also it can be another way to do the same thing. So you can spin up another service which is dedicated to your unit test. In this case, it makes it easier because, like, when we move from testing on QA to testing on prod, then we are also testing that even the data side of things is playing well, even on prod, right? Instead of mocking that part, because if you mock it, obviously that's going to be mocked even when you move to the next stage. On the other question, does that answer your question? Yes. So on the other question, yeah, that's really opinionated, actually, the data attributes. In our case, we found that it was just less confusing for us to look at something and seeing, for example, classes that had no definition in the styling. Sometimes it just, for example, we're using a library of components being developed by another team, right? So we don't really have much markup. Much styling that we write ourselves. So we would end up having classes, CSS classes, just for the purpose of the test and not for the purpose of the styling or any other semantical purpose. So in that case, since React just spread those data attributes to the elements as well, we just figured that it was a good way to just make the test the elements identifiable, and essentially just by reading the value, it was evident what was the purpose of it. But yeah, there may be different opinions on that. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we had a couple of more questions, right?
Hi. I think you might have already just answered this in relation to your end-to-end tests. With your cleanup tasks toward the end, I assume the assumption is that you are starting with a pristine environment, that the data you're cleaning up is, it will be there. Do you think that adds like level of fragility into your end-to-end tests, and that other data might affect them, or is that just assume that they'll be fine to just testing functionality in that way?
So you're saying that there might be some fragility in running those cleanup actions at the end, so that they might not work, or sorry. So your cleanup tester, the example you gave, you're targeting specific accounts or specific users, for example. Yeah, so you're starting with pristine environment. You're loading in sample data. You're loading in those new accounts. So is there any like fear that that your end-to-end tests might be affected by that? I think that's what I'm trying to say. So actually, no, actually it was quite the opposite. So before starting cleaning up properly all those actions, sometimes we were just having leftovers from the previous execution, and that made the test more fragile. So we were like running the test again the second time and not having the data that we were expecting. And even creating new data at the beginning, typically that's not fragile, because the way we do it, we use our, basically it's like we're running those actions as an Ajax call from within the page, and we still have to wait for that action to take place before running the rest of the suite. So say, for example, your first test is to say, I don't know, make sure that there are more than one element in a page, right? Before that, you have a test, sorry, say your test is about pagination, okay? So you have multiple, you need to have at least 10 items in your page, and you're paginating 5 at a time, right? So in this case, we have a previous, let's say a before method where we run the actions to create those items. So essentially, by the time you get to the next step, those items are in the database. So there's no, at least we didn't experience any fragility in this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lamberto. And I could think of 10 more questions, but let's leave those for the end of the evening. So we're going to have a panel after. And let's have a 5 to 10 minute break. Let's grab some drinks and refresh, and then we can come back. Okay, I think we can start. All right. One more thing I, of course, forgot to say. I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Sarah. I work in HubSpot for about almost 2 years now. And I know that if you've been to any of our previous meetups, you're used to Kian hosting the event. So I know like no one can replace Kian. He's just the best. But here's me this time. So, so what's going to happen next? We're going to have Elizabeth with her talk, and we are going to have a few questions for her. After that, we're going to have a super short break, and we're going to have a panel. So stick with us. Elizabeth, welcome.
Hello. So my name is Elizabeth, and I like to be called Milky Meal. So if you search in the web for Milky Meal, you can find, it's like a Japanese name. I think I like Japanese culture. Don't know why. Maybe in the past I used to be Japanese. Right now I'm working as a UX, UI designer and developer. And I like to say that I'm more a designer who likes to code rather than a developer, because my code is not the best in the world, but I can achieve things. So for this talk, the talk is called Illustration as Components. So I'm going first to talk about SVGs. What is an SVG? I'm not sure if you're familiar, but are you using SVGs in your daily job? Yeah, so that's cool. So then I will talk about SVG Illustration as Components. What is that? And I will talk about 2 projects that I did, one called Cassette Tape and the other called React Kawaii. So basically, what is a SVG? This is just the definition from the Wikipedia. It says that SVG is an XML-based vector image. It's very similar to the HTML markup language, so very similar. I like this definition from Ivailo from SitePoint.com. It says that under the hood, SVG documents are nothing more than simple plain text files that describe lines, curves, shapes, colors. And the best thing is you can have an image and they can be modifiable with CSS or JavaScript. So it has more flexibility, more versatility that other traditional image files like the PNG, GIFs, or JPEGs. So this is my own definition. SVG is an image with superpowers. That's what I like to say. And why should you use SVG? First, because it's scalable. You can have a very small image and it's small and you can put like the size that you want and put it really big always with the same quality because it's a vector. The file size, so you always have the same file size no matter the height or width that you want to achieve. So it's really good. And the best thing for me is because it's modifiable. It's like you can have an SVG and you can say, I want this part of SVG with this color. I want this shape to be bigger or smaller. So it's really good. So SVG illustration as components. To start to, this concept is you can create something like an image, and then it will create like a document with this XML markup that you can then modify with JavaScript or CSS. So, but for do that, you have to use the inline SVG. You can use the SVG like an image element, but basically if used like that, it's almost the same that using that like a JPEG or a GIF. Or you can embed it via object or iframe. I never tried using this way. I know that some people use this way and they can manipulate, but I prefer to just embed like HTML and just I can play with the code and I can insert classes, CSS classes, and I can do whatever I want with IDs. So when should you transform an SVG into a component? This is by my own experience. So I've found two ways or two use cases to transform it. The first case is when you have like a very complex UI. So something that maybe you can do that with HTML and CSS, but you think, oh, it's so difficult to achieve this. So you just need to go to your Sketch or Illustrator, you design wherever you want, and then you manipulate it. Or you can use, when you need to use illustration to handle different scenarios. That's the second use case, to create like a SVG to transform into a component. So the first case, there is the one that when you have like a very complex scenario and you start thinking, oh, should I create this with HTML and CSS and JavaScript? Or should I just do like an SVG and then manipulate it? So a few years ago, I'm from Lisbon. And so 2 years ago, I was living in Lisbon. So I created one project called Cassette Tape. And my first idea, I went to an iOS course. My idea was to be like an iOS developer. And the end of the course, I realized that I didn't want that for my life. But it was really painful. I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is so difficult. I could achieve this so easily with CSS, but I'm doing this with my life. So my final project was just a cassette tape. Because I like hip hop, I wanted just to press play and have like a bit an instrumental, but it was so hard to achieve that I couldn't. I did it, the code was working, but the design was ugly. And you know, auto layout and this thing that Apple created, and I said no. So after that, I stayed with this in my mind. I have to create this project. And one day I realized that I could achieve that in the browser, like use the microphone input from the browser. Browsers like Chrome, you can use that. So then I started thinking, how can I create this cassette, this design? Can I do it with CSS, with HTML? I thought, yes, I can do it. But I thought, oh, it's easier if I create with Sketch, and then I export it as an SVG, and then I can manipulate. So if you see, I have there the pause and the play, one on top of the other. It's on purpose. It's not because I'm not a good designer. So when you create like SVG, you put all the elements there, everything that you need. And then with the code, you can then with the code say, insert classes, and then you can say, I want with JavaScript, I want to hide this. I want to do whatever like you want. So basically, this is all the code for this project. It's just an HTML file with all the embedded inline SVG inside. I use it as we go to, you know, optimize a little bit. And then I use this library called Snap SVG. And Snap SVG is almost like the jQuery for manipulate SVGs. So basically, this is the type of the way that I will write code. Is nothing fancy, just. And then this is a part of the code. Basically, if you play pause, it's like a function. If you click the play or the pause, the music is going to play. Now I can show you a demo. So basically, this is the project. I'm using like the microphone inputs. So in the back, you can see my voice. Hello. So basically, and if I press play, there's the hip hop. I can record, and when I stop, it creates here. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So then it was my first time using the SVG, and for me it was a little bit what I didn't like in that way using that type of code was I had to have all the code in one file. So you end up with a really big markup in your HTML file, and then my JavaScript code to manipulate that I was using that Snap SVG was just one big file. Maybe I could split the code somehow, but I didn't know how. So when I arrived in Ireland, I started working with React. And for me, as someone in between design and development, I found, oh, this is easy. So React for me is not that difficult, but I think it's the purpose of React for UI. So it's really easy to achieve things. So I have an idea of creating a library that I call a library of cute SVG illustrations. So I can say that as a designer, my skills are not the best just because I'm lazy. So, so when I design something, I always try to make something simple, reusable, and that can cover different scenarios because I don't like the developers saying, oh, I need this, I need that. So I just try to do something for covering all the scenarios. So one day I came up with this idea of like the bootstrap that can have these like alerts components that you can have like the success, info, warning, and danger states. I thought, okay, maybe I can have like an image with different states. And then I said, okay, I also like this Japanese culture, and I like kawaiis. And what is the kawaii is like an image with a cute face on it. So it's like almost anything can be a kawaii. So if I have like a computer, I can put a face on it, and now it's a kawaii. So for me, I start implementing this in the company that I'm working called Showtime Analytics. So basically, oh, we need the error state, a planet with a cute face on it. Because it's an error, I put a sad face. No, it needs something happy. It's a happy face. And that's the way that I create illustrations. So first, for creating this project, first I defined the elements that I wanted. So I defined 3 different illustrations. The first one is called the Kawaii Planet. The second one is Kawaii Browser. The third one, you have to guess. Kawaii Ice Cream. Yeah. So basically, the first thing that I did was from Sketch, the same that I did with the cassette tape, grabbing old, exporting from Sketch to SVG. Then there's a problem with React. It's a little bit annoying. React doesn't read SVGs because SVG is similar to HTML, and React uses the GSX. So I have to to put the SVG into GSX. So I found like there's a website where it can convert SVG to GSX. I know there's other tools. I prefer this visual tool that I just put there the code and I can see the GSX. So my first step was just putting in React these 3 components. So after that, I just define the common components. What of these components are going to share? So in Similar, they have like the body, but then they share a face component. That's the name, face components. So a face component can have like different moods. It can be sad, shocked, happy, blissful, or love-struck. So basically, this is the face component. I have just this stateless component, and I have like it's receiving a props called mood. And then if you see, I can just a bunch of if statements say if the mood is happy, and I'm putting the part of the SVG with the happy face. If the mood is shocked, I put the part of the SVG with the shocked face. The same for sad and for the other moods. One thing that I did, and I learned this part with the community, the open source community. First, I had, like in the cassette tape, the paths, a lot of numbers all over the code, and then I just split it into a different file. I also used the SVGo to improve like the SVGs. And after that, I defined the kawaii components that receives different props. As you can see, like the prop size, height, color, width, height, I said, and the face is here, you see. So this is the kawaii planet. And then I just need to call the component, and for instance, if I have the kawaii planets, because I have different props, I can say the size that I want, the mood, the color. So it's really easy. Then I can give this to developers, and they don't need to, every time they need in a new situation, like now I have a 404 error page, and I just say, oh, use the planet with the sad face. And it's much easier. They don't need to wait for me to create, to send. And so basically this is how I'm calling the components. And it's an open source, it's on GitHub. You can use npm if you want to install it. And now the demo. I'm using the style guides to create the components. So that's the Kawaii browser. I can say it's sad or is happy. Can change the color. The size. So basically, this is the React.
This is very interesting. Do we have any questions for Elizabeth? Here's one.
Probably a little stretch, but have you ever considered like animating from one state to the other one?
Yes.
Is that challenging or?
Yeah, I considered, and there in the GitHub, some people asking, oh, can we have like animations? And there one developer that starting animating and is using these for some of his talks. but I didn't implement it yet. But the idea is in the future, you can have like animations. Another thing that I want like is have like the grayscale instead of always having colors, and have more components like just not 3, have more kawaiis. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I'm trying to create an animation, but it happens, basically it's a cycle, but when you click it, it then loads up a login event. So it's using SVGs to do a continuous loop through a cycle. And then obviously if you touch the screen, it then reacts to that and allows you to do something. Is this something that you could use in SVGs for? Is that difficult to do?
Yeah, I think you can use almost for anything. I think it's more how you use it. Like if you use a library like the Snap SVG, it's basically you can create like big animations. It's just like click events and do something with CSS. But there's other libraries like the GSAP. I think it's really good if you want like to animate and create more things. So I think you can have a look to GSAP.
Thank you.
I think we have room for one more. Okay, so let's give a big applause to Elizabeth. Okay, just checking. So it's been a long evening, so I appreciate every one of you who stayed for the panel. So if you have any more questions for our two speakers, shoot now.
Yeah, it's testing questions too, actually. Do you find you have browser stack based failures? So, you know, like random failures, the browser's not starting up or something like that. Is that something that happens a lot, or?
Actually, yeah, that's something that sometimes happens.
That's not the answer I was hoping for.
I know. So some of them are sometimes our fault, but there are definitely some of the failures are just random. It seems to be more frequent with like specific browsers. For example, again, not to point the finger against Internet Explorer, but we did have more issues on that than on the other browsers. So in that case, it's a bit difficult to say it's the browser stack ecosystem or the driver implementation. But in terms of random failures, yeah, sometimes we have, for example, the session wasn't bootstrapping, the browser itself wasn't loading at all. And then you just get a timeout essentially from your test, and that's really out of your control. So yeah, definitely there's still space for improvements. We're experiencing those issues as well. But on average, it's kind of reliable, let's say.
And the other question is around your tests written in JavaScript. I was just wondering, did you try WebDriver IO? Is that just Selenium? Is that just Selenium, vanilla Selenium, or WebDriver IO, or did you look at it? Or
we're using Selenium WebDriver. We used to use Python before with the previous version of Selenium. We were using Selenium 2, as far as I know. But now we're basically just using JavaScript. New version 3, the new Selenium WebDriver.
So it's vanilla Selenium, basically. Yes. Okay, and you're happy with that, and that's pretty fine.
I think it's working fine so far. We haven't. I mean, I can't complain. It's once you get those little issues set up, and you have your workarounds, because you do need workarounds for some things in place. It's actually quite smooth to create new tests. We do that like on our day-to-day. We just create new tests for new features we're building and stuff. So it doesn't feel. We don't see many complications with the current stack, apart from those random failures, and that's mostly it.
Just that we have Java selling tests, and it's horrible.
Java. I've seen those. Actually, I see. Whenever I try to look up things on the internet, I see many examples done in Java, more in Java than in JavaScript, actually. I was actually wondering how the asynchronous calls work in Badly. Great. We're going to stick with JavaScript, I think, in this case. Yeah. Cool.
If I remember correctly, recently you had something nasty about tests not being able to run at all in Safari or something?
Yes, we had an issue with Safari, essentially starting from Safari 47. The support dropped completely from the original Selenium driver that we were using. And this was broken for a long time until, I think, just recently they released this Jekyll driver, which finally works with the new versions of Safari. And that's essentially how you do it. You install the new driver and you use the Selenium 3.6, starting from 3.6.0. And that starts to work. It breaks support for the previous versions. So it doesn't work anymore with Firefox 46, which I don't believe people are using anymore. So anyway, those are those browsers that you typically keep always updated. So it's fine. Many challenges in there.
Any other questions?
Hi, just for Elizabeth on the SVGs. What type of components would you envision like a team building out with this? Would they be kind of small ones, like just around very specific buttons, or would you envision a kind of larger components being built out with maybe I think with more animation, or just small building blocks that you would incorporate day to day?
For instance, in my company, we have a lot of data visualization. Some of them you can use like with D3, iCharts, but some of them are very specific. So you can design what you want to achieve. And if it's like a progress, something there is progressing like a circle, and you have inside a gauge that goes until 100%, you can create that with SVG and then just use pure JavaScript to animate that, saying from 0 to 100%, I want this type of animation. So we have this different type of data visualization that you don't have a library for that. And other cases, this type of illustrations that to handle different scenarios. So you just need to call them. And the icons. Also, there's a lot of people with React that just create like small React components with the icons, with SVG icons inside. So basically you can say, I want this color, and I think basically for that, I think basically when you have really difficult UI that it's really hard to achieve with UC, and I think the data visualization is a really good example. That's why D3 and all the charts libraries with SVG.
Sorry, stop.
Do you need to fix your mic?
I think it's fine. Can you guys hear me? Cool.
Sorry, and just to follow up on that. Before this evening, I never really thought about mocking up SVGs and Sketch and exporting them as React components, but I have seen building React components and then importing the Sketch as SVGs. Have you found, or would you see anything coming back from your dev teams, like they're making components, oh, this would probably be great as an SVG, and sending it back your way? Or is that something that I've just thought up and I'm totally going to patent it?
Yeah, I think when the company that I'm working is like a startup, so the first time the product that we had, it was I can say today that it was a awful product, but because one of the investors were like Alibaba, and we wanted to impress, we created like the login page, and the dashboard was like, we had clouds moving, a cinema with lights animating. It was like a dashboard, but it was, when we wanted to place it like cinema cons, everyone was stopping. Wow, what's that? Like to go inside dashboard, you have to click on a planet. So it was really difficult to achieve that if you're using just HTML and CSS. So we designed the planets, the cinema, and the lights from the cinema with SVG, and then we just animated. And in the end, it was almost like an UI because you could click the cinema to go to one place. You could click one planet. You can click one cloud. So nowadays we have a common UI. The product in the end nowadays it's normal, you know. But I think when you have this type of scenarios, you can just design it and animate.
So another testing question. Who writes the tests? Who sets the standards? Maybe do you guys have a group doing that, or and who runs them? Who makes sure that they're always green, etc.
So that's really up to the team at the moment. So every team has. So first of all, we write our own tests as a normal day-to-day work. So every developer which is working on the front end, there are tests on the back end as well, but in particular for the front end, we usually write our own tests, and there's no real expectations, as in there's no hard threshold that you need to reach or anything like that. So it's really, we have this rule in HubSpot, which is use good judgment, and which pretty much applies to every single aspect of the company. And in this case, it applies as well to testing. It seems like it's growing a lot recently. So we've been doing some some meetings around this. There are a few teams here in Dublin that are meeting on a weekly basis to discuss basically about automation tests, and we are starting a library to share that we are sharing across the company to so these are a set of operations that we do daily. So we have our own components library. Okay, so we're building also some. This is still in progress, but we're also building a set of helpers in Selenium to just test those components. And essentially, yeah, there's no central entity that's ruling all those things. It's just naturally growing from the engineers.
And you write both UTs and the end-to-end tests, yeah?
Sorry?
You write both UTs and the
Yeah, we write both things, yeah. We don't have a QA department.
I do have to admit, though, that around 2 years ago, we were, at least HubSpot Dublin, were much worse in front-end testing. We didn't have everything covered, and we were much smaller group of engineers. So sometimes we would go with the excuse, okay, we're going to just develop something new versus spend a lot of time on the test because we don't have as many engineers as we would love to. But in the last 2 years, we are trying to get better at it, and we, especially now, when we are a much bigger group of people, we have more space and time for testing, and we are really paying attention to it.
That's cool. In one of my previous companies, we had a dedicated automation test team, and my experience on that is that it was always out of sync. So we were going with features and features, developing features, and they were always catching up. So it didn't really play well for us. Whether in this other company I worked for, it was more of a, yeah, you build anything and then you have to create an automation test for it. So I think here it's pretty much the good balance. So we are building our own tests, which also makes us more responsible of the code that we are writing. We also catch we also catch bugs as we create the tests. So there's this test which is going from one page to the other page, then going back to the previous page, and suddenly it's broken because there was an issue, for example, in the reducer, and we have a JavaScript error, and then we just captured that, and we didn't try that, for example, on manually. So I think it's working fine for us at the moment. And now that we have more engineers, it's definitely more in our day-to-day than it was before. So it's really good.
I think we have room for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We have 3 hands, so let's try.
I would like to ask a question about unit test and integration test. Where do you put differentiate those in the code base? Are those in different code base, same file, different files?
So we have it in the same code base at the moment. The way we structure our apps is that we basically have a deployment going on for just the main app, and we have a second deployable, which is essentially just the acceptance tests. So obviously the unit tests are within the main app, right? So they're running every time we're doing a new build. Obviously not that they don't go in production code, but in the acceptance tests, that's basically a standalone deployable, which runs after the main deployable is deployed. So those are conceptually two separate apps, let's say, but in our case, we just for ease of development, we just have them in the same repository. So every app has its own acceptance tests, even though they run separately.
So the integration test is something that runs on Selenium, or like a unit test but more elaborated?
No, it runs well. It's a Selenium test that runs through Mocha in our case, which is separate from the normal unit test. It's not more elaborated. The difference is that the unit test is actually just spinning up an headless browser, whether the actual acceptance test is like loading the full browser and like pointing the cursor in the page to click stuff. So they're a bit different.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have any automated tests for your CSS, or like if someone changes some styles and something breaks, is there a way to catch that in an automated fashion? Or?
So if we have anything in particular for just visual issues, we don't as a team, but I know there's another team which is, for example, doing image diffing from the previous to the next iteration. So that's something that we still don't have standardized across the company. There are some discussions around it, but not there yet. But it's something cool, especially when you're working on something really heavy on the like animations and UI, and even the smallest change can just make the UI completely different. So in those cases,
Do you know what tool the other?
I don't remember the name. No. No, sorry.
We can try to look it up, and you can drop us a message or whatever, so we can chat more about that if you're interested. And let's take the last one.
This is just about React UI. What is your integration with other images, or do you have a limited library of images that you can apply the faces to? Because the faces seem quite separate from the image.
Yeah, but, I designed it on Sketch. So basically what I do is like when I designed like the planet sort with a face inside it, so I know where I should replace with the face component. But everything I did it on Sketch and just split it in different parts of code. So the faces went to one component, and the body itself, it's other component that calls the face component.
Oh, so because there's separate components, it would be easy enough to kind of individualize the face onto
it's not that easy to separate. That's why when I design on Sketch, you have to try to rename properly all your folders, because each folder it will create an ID. Oh. So what I do is like the parent folder I call like React Kawaii Planets, then React Kawaii Face, inside the face folder React Kawaii Eyes, Mouth, and everything. So I know. And then when I'm looking to the SVG that was generated, I can see in this part of the ID is the face. I'm going to remove and put the face components in them. Yeah. And also the SVGo, if you want to optimize, you have to modify it a little. So there is a plugin for Sketch that you can say that you still want to keep the IDs, because if you used this optimizer without modifying it, it will going to remove all the IDs, and then it was just going to see a lot of paths and code, and you can't see what is what. So I just try to give good names so I can see the code properly.
Okay, so thank you to Elizabeth and Lamberto, and thank you all for coming. We definitely read all of your feedback, so when we message you with the feedback, thanks for responding to that. And see you next time.